Okay, everybody, make sure you got your note sheet out. What we're taking a look at today is progressive presidents in terms of three guys: Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. By the end of this video lecture, we want you to understand this mastery question in that how did Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson embrace progressive ideals? So as we've been talking about the progressive era and individuals within it and how they tried to use the government's power to create social change, this is going to be it from the flip side. How did these politicians react to some of the problems of this era? So let's start with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, I'm just going to call him TR through the rest of this, shaped the modern presidency. He's a new kind of president. He achieved quite a bit prior to becoming president. Some things across his life that he did is that he won the Nobel Prize. He was a physical culturalist, a naval historian, writer, paleontologist, taxidermist, ornithologist, field naturalist, conservationist, big game hunter, editor, critic, ranchman, speaker, rancher, civil service reformer, socialite, patron of the arts, colonel of the cavalry, former governor of New York, expert on big game mammals in North America, and of course, president of the United States. He was a Harvard graduate in 1880, went on to law school at Columbia University, but before he can graduate, joined the New York State Assembly. An unfortunate circumstance took place 3 years into that job when both his mother and his wife died on Valentine's Day, causing him to really go through a tough period in his life in which he moved out west and became a outdoorsman, as you see in the image to the left here. After a couple of years, the itch to get back into politics came back, and he became the president of the New York City Police Commissioners Board. Shortly after that, he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, then left that post, led the Rough Riders, which was a cavalry unit in the Spanish-American War, gained a lot of popularity from that, became the governor of New York, and then, because of his reform spirit and the fact that some people wanted to push him out of New York, became William McKinley's vice president in 1900. So some of the images that you see here are some of the things I just talked about. So him in the Rough Riders in the upper left, him as governor of New York on the upper right, and then you see William McKinley on the bottom, who was assassinated in 1900 shortly after being elected, which caused Teddy Roosevelt to take the presidency. There was an interesting little story that occurred in 1902 in a hunting trip in Mississippi that eventually became legendary when he refused to shoot an exhausted black bear, which had been run down by a pack of his hounds and roped to a tree, and as a result of that, didn't feel sporting, didn't shoot it. And this cartoon you see here by cartoonist Clifford Berryman drew a reenactment of the scene, which inspired a toy shop owner in Brooklyn to create the very first teddy bear. So let's take a look at what he did in terms of progressive acts while in the presidency. The post-Civil War United States had generated enormous wealth and power for men who controlled industry and business, as we've talked about. And regulating the great business trust to foster fair competition was one of Roosevelt's primary concerns. One of the first things that he did in 1906 was pass a law known as the Hepburn Act. And what this did was to give the government authority to set and limit shipping costs set by the railroad companies. If you recall, when we talked about populism, that was one of the major concerns of the farmers. Another thing that he did was he sought to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act, which forced companies to split into smaller companies to allow fair competition. As you see in this image to the left, it calls him the lion tamer. Now, he did believe that not all large companies were bad trusts. He did see a difference in good and bad trust. So instead of being a trust buster and bringing large companies down, he became known more of a trust tamer. Some of the other things that he did, primarily regarding social issues, was as a result of reading Upton Sinclair's The Jungle in 1906. He was horrified and infuriated by the state of meatpacking plants, specifically in the city of Chicago, and he urged Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act. What this did is it gave federal agents the ability to inspect meat that was sold across state lines and required federal inspection of meat processing plants. This regulation is one of the lasting legacies of progressivism in that it is obviously the insistence that the government take responsibility for food safety. Another thing that did something very similar during his era was the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which banned interstate shipments of impure food and the mislabeling of food and drugs. Today, the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, still enforces this same law. Where he really put his stamp of the presidency the most is clearly in the area of environmental conservation. His reverence for nature shaped his policies. He was an avid outdoorsman and took steps to conserve resources. However, you see on the far right, he was also a avid hunter. In 1891, Congress gave presidents the power to protect the land by creating federal forests. And like I said, this area marks TR's greatest legacies. He set aside over 100 million acres of forest land and established 5 national parks. What you take a look at here are some of the national parks that have been created over the years as we see them today. Maybe you visited one, but it is, like I said, under the president's control to make this land federally protected. There was also some symbolisms in terms of civil rights, as we talked about the creation of the NAACP and different civil rights leaders such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. In 1901, he invited Booker T. Washington to a dinner at the White House. Although he received a lot of flack for this, it did show his willingness as president to introduce a civil rights legislation and acceptance. Now, as we move forward, Roosevelt was president from 1900 to 1908. No law existed just yet to prevent a third term, but at this point in time, after 2 terms, TR decided that he would leave the presidency and wish to enjoy a private life. He would do things such as go on a 10-month African safari, travel to the Middle East as well as Europe. So as he steps down, the Republican Party followed his counsel and in 1908 nominated William Howard Taft as the next Republican nominee for the presidency. Teddy Roosevelt thought that Taft would continue to carry the torch of his reforms, but the Republican Party and its members felt that it would be able to mold Taft's actions. And in fact, Taft would set his own agenda, much of which Teddy Roosevelt would go on and criticize. We see Teddy Roosevelt as well as Taft right here. So we take a look at the 1908 election map, and it's fairly divided. William Howard Taft being the Republican candidate, and a man that we've talked about quite a bit, William Jennings Bryan, the Democratic candidate, which would be his 3rd and final run for the presidency and 3rd and final loss, causes Taft to gain the seat of the president. So Teddy Roosevelt and Taft differ quite a bit. Taft's agenda was not as reform-based as Teddy Roosevelt probably would have hoped. However, it was more of a trust-busting entity than TR's. Taft's Justice Department brought lawsuits against twice as many corporations, enforcing the Sherman Antitrust Act, but at the same point in time, he relaxed the hard lines set by this Antitrust Act, and he allowed big monopolies to exist as long as they did not unreasonably squeeze out smaller competition. So this would go on obviously for 4 years. However, towards the end of his term, Teddy Roosevelt would return and would begin to speak the country about what he called New Nationalism, a program to restore the government's trust-busting power in a 3rd term that he would seek in the election of 1912. Now, getting a little bit older and maybe a little less support, the fact that Taft and Teddy Roosevelt split the Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt would not run as a Republican, but as a third-party candidate. So within this, we'll get to it in a minute, the Democratic opposition would be a man by the name of Woodrow Wilson, a former Princeton professor and Princeton University president, and eventually became the governor of New Jersey. He had a plan for his presidency which looked very similar to Roosevelt's in that he called it New Freedom, and it placed very strict government control on corporations and provided greater opportunities for small business. So as we move forward, I want you to think about this. On the very left here, we have a picture of an elephant representing the Republican Party and its candidate Taft. The third party candidate, being Teddy Roosevelt, ran under the Progressive Party, why is known as the Bull Moose Party, because he said he felt as strong of a bull moose. But if you see the division sign between them, it divided the Republican base, resulting in a victory for Woodrow Wilson. So it's pretty heavily won by Wilson, as you can see. Though he did not win the majority of popular votes, he received 4 times the number of electoral votes than the other 2 candidates. In doing so, he was the very first man born in the South to win the presidency in nearly 60 years. So as we take a look at how he regulates the economy, Wilson attacked what he called the triple wall of privilege. And this is tariffs, or otherwise known as tax on foreign goods, banks, and trusts. Early in his first term, he pushed for some new laws that would bring down these 3 walls and give the government more control over the economy. As we start with, let's take a look at the tariffs. Wilson aimed to prevent some big manufacturers from unfairly charging high prices to their customers. So to do this, he convinced Congress to pass the Underwood Tariff Bill, which lowered tariffs, or like I said, taxes on foreign goods, making those goods more affordable if American versions were too costly. He also was president when the 16th Amendment was passed, and it gave Congress the power to create a graduated income tax, which required wealthier individuals to pay a higher percentage of their income than poorer people. The revenue from the income tax made up enough money for the government, lost by lowering the tariffs on imports. Another area was the banks. So Wilson tried to reform the banking system. In 1913, he pushed Congress to pass the Federal Reserve Act, which puts bank under the control of the Federal Reserve Board, which even today helps protect the American economy from having too much money end up in the hands of one person, a bank, or just one region. The Fed, as it's also known, sets interest rates that banks pay to borrow money from other banks, and it supervises banks to make sure that they are well run. So it provides a little bit more protection to the consumer. Another area was trusts, and like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft, he felt that trusts were not as dangerous as long as they did not engage in unfair practices. So Congress passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened earlier antitrust laws by spelling out those activities in which businesses could not engage. There's also one other thing that I don't have up there, known as the Federal Trade Commission, which would monitor business practices to prevent them from leading down the path of becoming a monopoly. Unfortunately, what Wilson is also known for is being somewhat of a white supremacist. There was a film known as The Birth of a Nation that came out during his presidency, and the film chronicled the relationship of 2 families in the Civil War Reconstruction America. And the film was a commercial success, but it was highly controversial, primarily due to the fact that black men in the movie were portrayed by white actors, but they're also portrayed as unintelligent, sexually aggressive towards white women, and it actually portrayed the KKK as a heroic force. Some say that it even inspired the second era of the KKK, but under Wilson, it was the first film shown in the White House. So with these 3 presidents, we start to see a lasting legacy, not only from what they've done, but also from some of the things that occurred during the Progressive era. Initiative, referendum, recall, as well as the 19th Amendment were all things that would expand the influence of voters, powers of the people. Antitrust laws such as the Sherman or Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Trade Commission would watch closely over the economy. And we also know that progressive years were also expanding the government's role in managing national resources. All right, sorry about that, guys. No more phone calls. So while progressivism did not fix all the problems of American society, as obviously there's still dishonest sellers, unfair employment practices, problems in schools, cities, public health. What these reformers did was to usher in an America that we are more familiar with, as the government has played a larger role in the lives of America to fix societal issues.